So I think the goal here today is we were hosting a webinar called "The Essential Steps to Building a Successful Scholarship." Now, obviously, the term "successful" can be kind of interpreted however you want, and we hosted a very similar style webinar here last week for both scholarship providers as well as grant makers. And I think many of you are also going to be in that same ballpark of grant maker. And so as we were doing that webinar, we just had an overwhelming number of questions pop up, and it actually kind of came out to be more so like a lack of processes and systems in place that impacted some of the steps that go into building a successful program. So what I want to do here today is start with kind of a recap of that, but then also kind of dive into deeper, like what are some of the operational roadblocks that we kind of continue to run into. Um, I'll set the stage here in just a second with a quick introduction of who I am and kind of how we got to this point. But basically what we did is we audited roughly the last 100 or so conversations that we had. And we were able to kind of very easily identify 4 to 5 bottlenecks that many organizations run into. And then we kind of converted those into like raw, tangible best practices or insights or takeaways that you can take and apply to your programs right away. So my main goal here today is obviously, we'll talk more about like what Reviewr is, but if there's one small takeaway that you can take and apply to your programs, I consider that a win. So that's kind of my commitment to you guys, is to see if I can provide, just one small tangible benefit that you can right away implement with or without Reviewr. So let's kind of jump into things. So kind of a quick introduction of who I am and what we do here at Reviewr. So my name is Kyle. I'm the CEO. We started this company back in about 2012. We did so from a very unique perspective. We actually found ourselves as volunteers as part of the review committees for scholarships, grants, funding opportunities, and things like that. And when I say a volunteer, that typically means we're part of the review committees. And way back in 2012, platforms like Reviewr didn't exist. So most scholarship and grant making initiatives were done through, believe it or not, paper. So we literally had hundreds and hundreds of binders physically mailed to our doorstep, asked, to handwrite notes and feedback and select recipients and mail it back. We meet with other committee members and we'd ultimately, justify and define who the recipients would be. Over time, you start to see that trend go online. So if you think through like a common program, you open up applications and at some point you're going to select recipients. So how do you get from point A to point Z? So most organizations started to spin up a combination of built-in web forms, emails, lots and lots of spreadsheets, Google Drive links, Microsoft tools, whatever it might be. So we as a volunteer found ourselves going to all these external places, downloading and exporting and recompiling and logging notes and spreadsheets. And for us, two very problematic things started happening. Number one is information got lost. So to the extent of, maybe it went to a spam filter, or as we're downloading and exporting, we had to recompile it. So we saw firsthand organizations offering a scholarship or grant where they went through an entire selection process. And then 6 months later, you had applicants reaching back out saying, hey, like, what were the results of it? Was I selected? Was I not selected? And these organizations are left saying, well, we never even got your application. What are you talking about? So it's very unfair. It's sad. It's also posing a potential compliance risk. We also started to see here in kind of our relatively close-knit community that we knew who the applicants were. And because of that, and without the ability to like redact data, it led to very clear biases in selection processes, who they were, demographic details, whatever it might be. So as a pure volunteer, we kind of got fed up with both the inefficiencies of these programs, but also some of the negative consequences that came from it. And that's what led us to build Reviewr. We'll kind of explore our platform here a little bit today, not necessarily as a demo of the tool, but more so as a way to kind of visualize a lot of these concepts and these deliverables. But we've basically taken now a decade plus of experience, and we're very fortunate to be at the forefront of hearing in real time from people like yourselves, like what are the challenges that you guys run into on a daily basis? And if we ourselves don't have solutions or knowledge of the topic, we certainly have the connections or other clients that do. And so that's kind of how we culminate in these webinars, is basically bringing to you, like, what are we hearing? What are these hot topics? And then again, how can we solve these collectively? So within today's conversation, I'll have the chat pulled up. If you guys have any questions or comments, or if you want to kind of contribute, by all means, toss questions in there in real time. We can either address them as we go, we can save them for the end, but I want to make these conversations as dynamic as we possibly can. So again, the main goal here today was to talk about like what are some of like the common best practices that result in a successful program. And as we started to unpack that, what we basically started to figure out is that there's like 5 to 6 very consistent operational challenges that most organizations run into. And now it may not be all 5 of them, but at least one of them may apply to you guys. And once some of these operational challenges start to fall, it'll start to have a negative impact on virtually the rest of the program. So before you can kind of get into like steps and best practices, I think we first have to solve some of these challenges. Otherwise, we're kind of working against the eight ball and putting ourselves into a position where we're not going to be successful. So what we did really quickly is we basically summarized from well north of 100 different conversations, like what are the core challenges that we run into, and then how do they start to intertwine with one another. So kind of categorize. The first one is manual and inefficient processes. And I know it's at a very high level, but a lot of organizations, if they think through, again, I've used this example already, if you think from point A is opening up your scholarship or your grant applications, and then point Z is kind of awarding of funds or celebrating the outcomes, whatever you defined the definition of done as, we rely very heavily on those. It means that we're spinning up built-in web forms, we're having PDF submissions, we're doing emails, we're downloading of documents. And we often forget about like the magic happens between points B and point Y. And without the bulk of the work happening within there, we can't get to point Z. So as a real kind of tangible example, if you've got a bunch of applications coming in through emails and spreadsheets, and then you select scholars, but now you want them to come back and report impact. If that data doesn't already exist in a centralized hub, then that reporting becomes virtually impossible. So we're talking like the end goal here, which is measuring actual tangible impact of your scholarship. And without having that in mind and designing your structure and your processes around that, you're never going to be able to get to that point. So I think it's really critical for us to kind of think holistically around these programs, like what are all the moving parts? What do we want the end outcome to be? And then ensure that we have systems and processes in place along the way. So that includes everything from like the application of process and the intake, operationally speaking, like how do we get you guys into a centralized hub where you can manage applications, communication, workflows, reporting, everything in one spot. And then for me, equally, if not the most important kind of concept here is the review and selection process. I don't care about the dollar amounts or the funding we're providing. Every one of these are life-changing opportunities to the applicants. So how do we ensure that each and every one of them gets the fair time, energy, and kind of commitment from your review team? And again, the only way we can do that is also being sensitive to their time, because a lot of times they are volunteers, right? I've got two kids, and if I was asked to be committee, I'm probably doing this at 10:30 on a Wednesday night. But with that in mind, how do you kind of maximize my 10:30, right? To make sure that I'm giving all the applicants the fair, thoughtful review that they deserve. So that's at a high level, some of the inefficient manual processes. If you want to toss any comments or notes, like if that is kind of like where you live with emails, spreadsheets, downloading of documents, built-in web forms, you name it. The second is the applicant experience, right? So I think a lot of times we think through these processes as program managers and operation teams, right? We're oftentimes nonprofits, we're foundations, we've got limited staff, limited budgets, and it's easy for us to kind of roll up our own sleeves and get to work and get the job done. But we forget that we make up a very small fraction of the program. The applicants, the review committees, the volunteers, your stakeholders actually make up at least 60 to 70% of the participation. And so how do we kind of build processes and structure around them, but also streamlining your time as well? So, we live in a time now, it's 2025. The applicants in these programs have a very clear kind of like desire of how they want to be engaged with. They don't want to be going to fillable PDFs. They don't want to be exporting. They don't want to be downloading. They don't want to have to send you an email with a bunch of attachments. They're used to using interactive tools and dedicated platforms for the task at hand. They want to be able to enter their application process, submit to you the content and deliverables that you need from them in a very low barrier manner. They want to be able to do it from a mobile device, right? The large demographic of people will at least start these processes on their phones or their tablets and then maybe finish on a computer. They want to be communicated with every step of the way. They want to know if you got their application. They want to know like their progress, where they're at within the workflow. Are they selected or not selected? If you need more content and deliverables from them later on, so maybe updated transcripts or ideally speaking, you do surveys for impact tracking, like they want to be able to do that with a very low barrier for participation. And then on top of that, when it comes to things like file uploads, again, we live in a time now where if you use your iPhone or your phone to take a photo or a video, it's like 5 or 6 times bigger than what it was 3 years ago. And there's like 6 or 7 different types of file formats. So how are we collecting these documents and these deliverables in a way that you can actually physically view and access and not have your review teams having to download and export them or not even have the ability to view it in the first place? On top of that, a lot of times these file uploads may be coming from external people, so transcript offices, references, which we're going to kind of get into. So how do you lower the barrier for them as well? The next thing that we kind of want to look at here is going to be the centralized processing for you guys. So again, I already kind of a high level touch on that on the first slide, but if you think through what these programs look like, it's not just collecting applications and selecting recipients. There's so many moving parts in between. So, managing progress, sending reminder emails, being able to centralize and aggregate information, being able to view content, collect more information from them, collaborate with your teams. And especially in a program like this, where we're quite frankly dealing with what I call personal information, so PII, either student information records, budgets, financials, tax documents, whatever it might be, we have to ensure that all of this data gets submitted in one spot and never leaves that place. We'll kind of get into some of the more compliance items down the road. But if we're taking data in a very safe, secure manner, anytime you export it, anytime you move it into an email or to a spreadsheet, you lose all that type of stuff, right? It's also very difficult to coordinate staff and team when you have them going to like 6 or 7 different places to execute tasks. I think as good as we all feel like we are with spreadsheets, running formulas and consolidating things, if one small row or one small cell or formula gets missed or miscalculated, it'll have an instant impact on absolutely everybody. So how do we automate a lot of those processes along the way? And then the last thing that we're going to kind of look at is the review and selection process. I do feel like we're going to spend the bulk of our time here talking through this because quite frankly, the success of a scholarship comes to the review and selection workflows. I've said it before, I won't beat a dead horse on this, that if there is a high barrier, you're going to have lower quality reviews. It's going to have an impact on the fairness and the experience for the applicants as well. So these are, again, life-changing opportunities. I will continue to reiterate that. Some of our metrics and some of our data suggest that on average, most volunteer review committee members really on average can't look at more than 15 to 25 submissions, depending on how complex they are. So if that is the case and you have a lot of applications, how do you create review workflows where the applicants or the review team can kind of come in, they can spend 20 to 30 minutes once their kids go to sleep and actually provide the thoughtful, fair review process that the applicants desire from them. On top of that, if you have your review team doing multiple things, so viewing submissions, looking at files, submitting scorecards, how do you keep them into one spot? Because there's a strong likelihood that they're going to be doing this on their couch with their tablets, right? So again, think end goal in mind and then work backwards of how do we implement processes and systems to execute those. The last thing that we're going to talk about today goes hand in hand with that, and it's how do we measure real impact? Now, this is kind of a polarizing conversation, and it's one that I think we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and ask, like, do we really want to know the results of it? But we're kind of moving to a time now where being able to report back on impact is critical. You and your stakeholders, as well as any potential donors, sponsors, want to know like what ROI is this program happening, right? So I'm going to make up a very simple number. If you have a $30,000 scholarship fund and you award, 25 people, like what do those 25 people do with the funding? Do they have higher grades than those that don't get scholarships? Do they have less student loan debt upon graduation? When they graduate, are they going to get a certain degree compared to if they hadn't got a scholarship? Are they going to be a higher income earner with their first job? Are they going to be getting jobs within their desired career path? All these are the questions that your teams and your board members and your stakeholders are going to be asking. And it's the ammunition that you need to go to help raise funds as well, right? So if you want to expand your scholarship from $30,000 to $100,000 and you go to a corporate sponsor or a foundation and say, look, here's the raw tangible impact that we had in these 18 people's lives. Now imagine what we can do with another $60,000. That's a very compelling story to have, but it's also one that we can't have without having this data. And again, going back to like your systems, if we don't have it centralized, you physically can't run reports on that. The second piece to that is if it is a scholarship program, how do we identify at-risk individuals, right? So you cut a check and you award a scholarship to an individual. How do we 6 months in identify that they're at risk of not pursuing their degree or whatever challenges that they might run into? And how do we kind of course correct and get them onto a better path for long-term sustainability and growth? So with all that said, and then we already talked about security and compliance. What I want to do is I want to walk you through actual examples for pretty much every one of those that I think you can implement right away with some actual best practices. So I'm not going to get too deep into the common issues. I already kind of touched on all of these, but the most common example here on the application side of things is using like an outdated non-modern experience. We have to get people online. It has to be low barrier. They have to be able to save. They have to be able to log out. They have to be able to come back later. Whatever content and deliverables that you need from them, you have to be able to collect in one sitting from them in one place, right? We never want them to start this journey, have to leave, and then go submit external stuff to you in another way. Also, from an operational perspective, like you definitely don't want to be getting a bunch of emails and spreadsheets sent to you on top of your forms and have to kind of figure out like, well, who is this for? What is it? How do I reconnect it? We have to get our hands off of any data or manual manipulation of it. So what are the best practices? And I'm going to show this to you is we have to be leveraging obviously like an online submission structure. More specifically, it has to be both mobile friendly and ADA accessible. I think that's a term that we often ignore, but there's obviously a large demographic of people who are use screen readers or whatever it might be. And so how do we ensure that whoever our demographic is, when they go to our form, we're actually presenting opportunities and no barriers on that front? I also want these forms to be interactive. And what I mean by that is that we want the applicants to focus all of their time and all of their energy on their content creation, right? They're trying to build a compelling story about themselves and why they're deserving of funding. We want them to never get bogged down into the details of how do I get this document? How do I fill out this form? How do I send it to them later on? Do they even get it or not? If you have multiple scholarships, I also want to lower the barrier for success by using what I call automation or personalized experiences. So how do we let the applicants start to submit content, and then based on their content, the systems can update and say, hey, based on what you just submitted, here's these 3 additional deliverables that we need from you. So they're not interacting with tools, tools are interacting with them. So a lot of words there. By design, I have a lot of content here. This will be sent out afterwards. You guys can kind of, but what I want to do is kind of practically show you what I'm talking about. So in this example, everything starts with the concept called a profile. And again, this is Reviewr to help visualize it, but the goal here is that no matter what tools or processes you have in place, you should be able to implement some version of this. So if we think through like an entire scholarship experience, there are so many moving parts. You've got people and then submissions. I say submissions plural because you might have like their initial application, you might have ongoing data collection like acceptance packets, thank you forms, impact surveys. You've got file uploads, you've got communication, you've got review and selections that are going on. And so the only way that you can systematize this is to take all of those elements that I just referenced and centralize them into one spot. So to do so, we use a concept called a profile. So applicant creates a profile, and then from there, it'll actually start to log all those other activities that I just mentioned on their account. So in this example, I'm not going to get too deep into the forms, but they can save, they can log out, they can come back later. I don't care if they're on their PCs or if they're on their mobile devices, they can still access this. Your entire goal with your application form should be to align the content that you're collecting with your own organization's personal mission and vision. So in this example, they focus on 3 core elements. I do feel like this is a really well-structured application. They focus on personal achievements, both academically, but also external. They focus on financial need. And then for me, the most important component to this is they focus on personal storytelling. There's no better way to give your applicants a voice or differentiate themselves from one entrant from another by letting themselves tell a personal story. So in this example, the applicants come in, they basically tell us who they are. From here, it uses that personalized automation that I talked about. So if you've got like 5 or 6 different types of scholarships, or if you've got a bunch of named scholarships or donors, what you could actually do is you can ask the applicant to answer a series of questions. And then based on their answer, our system could say, hey, based on what you just submitted, these are the 3 scholarships that we have available for you. Which of or all of them do you want to apply for? So this solves 2 big challenges. Number one is eligibility. It makes sure that only eligible applicants can apply to the program that they're eligible for. It also kind of makes it so you're not wasting their time or yours vetting through them. But number 2, which is probably more important, is that you might have a lot of opportunities available for people that they don't even know exist, right? And so the goal here is to don't make them do a bunch of reading and figure out what they should apply for. Instead, have them answer a series of questions, build a persona, and then based on that persona, let the system tell them exactly which they're eligible for and which ones they want to apply for. From here, if I choose the Brooke Marlowe Scholarship, I can get a completely different application form, completely different scorecard, completely different dates and deadlines. than if I would have chose the Jasper Rye scholarship, right? So again, you have one centralized entry point, and then using logic, it'll start to break people out into whatever journey or path that corresponds with them. The next step in this one is kind of that achievement section that I talked about. So we're getting transcript uploads, we're getting test scores, we're getting grades, we're getting extracurricular activities. From here, it moves into financial need. So this is kind of a gray area for most organizations because how do you define what financial need is? So for us, we want to focus on, I think, three concepts. Number one is some self-reporting. So like, what are your expected expenses? What's your current kind of savings that you have for this? If you don't get a scholarship, like how do you intend to pay for it? Again, it's all about building a persona. So do you have an applicant who's going to take out, 9% student loans? Or do you have an applicant that has, parents who are, the grandchildren of Warren Buffett, right? That will dramatically change who you decide to choose. On top of that, we get into like income, so both FAFSA information, 1040 tax documents, whatever content you want to collect. Now, the key thing here is there's a lot of really personal content being submitted. We've got tax documents, we've got FAFSA, and we got financial need. So the goal is to make sure that this is being submitted in a very safe, secure, compliant portal. And then once it gets submitted, it never leaves that tool. And we'll kind of come back to that later on. The third component that I want to talk about is personal storytelling. And so for me, you can do a couple different things or a combination of them. You can have your applicants answer short form content or essays. I think a lot of times organizations that offer multiple scholarships do a shared application form, and they do that primarily because having a bunch of different forms is not scalable with the current processes that they have in place. With this model, because we know exactly what scholarship that they're applying for, we can use the logic that says, hey, because you chose the Brooke Marlowe scholarship, this is the exact deliverables being requested from you for that particular scholarship. So I love doing essays. I also love the concept of a video essay. There's no better marketing collateral for you guys to celebrate your recipients than like a video that they submitted. It's very personal, it's very engaging. It may be a little bit higher of a barrier for them, so kind of keep that in mind, but it's a really good piece of content. The other aspects here are reference letters. I'm going to come back to this here in just a minute as we get into documents and deliverables. But anytime we start to inject letters of recommendation or references, we now have a third party involved. So not only do we have to think about the applicant experience, but also the experience for the reference, lowering the barrier for them, but also from your team's perspective, how do we make this manageable? If I've got 62 letters being mailed to me, how do I know who they belong to, what they are, how do I redact the information, how do I compile it with the application for my review team, et cetera? So let's talk a little bit about that, because the next thing I want to talk about is organizing the deliverables and the documents. So I would say on average, most scholarships have between 3 to 5 uploads or documents being collected. References, transcripts, resumes, grades, it could be some type of like essay content, things of that nature. Again, I'm not going to beat a dead horse with all these issues because we already reviewed these, but we live in a time now where they're going to be coming in a lot of different types of file formats. You might have 4 different resumes submitted in PDF, dot pages, dot Word documents, right? Seems like a very small thing, but anytime you've got a team member or a reviewer who's using a Mac and you send them a Microsoft Office document, how do we ensure that they can actually access it, right? On top of that, you have file uploads, you have size limitations, and then equally, if not the most important, is the data and security behind it. Every one of those files has to be stored in a very safe, secure manner. I want to go one step further and talk about accessibility. So if I'm part of your review committee and you're saying, hey, Kyle, I need you to review this applicant's reference letter, I need you to review their resume, I need you to review their transcript, as well as their initial scholarship application. What is the expectation from me? Am I going to be going to a Google Drive folder, finding their folder, downloading all those documents, trying to open up each and every one of them, make sense of it, and then come back to log my notes? Or is there a world that we can live in where I can side by side see all of these deliverables while leaving my comments, while leaving my notes, and while filling out my score sheets? And the answer to that question is yes. The last component here that we're going to look at is references. So we're going to start there just because that's where we left off on this page. So my gut tells me that a large percentage of you are collecting references. And if I'm wrong, toss it in the chat. The challenge with a reference letter is that it's a better reflection of the writing capability of the person submitting the reference, not who it's for. I love my wife to death, but if I wrote her a reference letter, it's going to be quite poor. I'm a bad writer. I'm going to wait to the very last minute. So how do we not penalize her as an applicant because of my poor writing ability? I talked earlier on that my main goal today is you can walk away with one insight that you can apply to your programs. Then I find this a success. I think for many of you, this will be that one thing. So the model here is to lower the barrier. So the applicants can actually put into the form who their references are. It can in real time trigger a notification. So it'd say, hey, Dwight, Kyle's asked you to write a reference on his behalf. Click here to do so. Now, the major change to this process is they enter our reference portal. So traditionally speaking, Dwight gets that email and then he or she sits down on Google Drive or on pen and paper and they write a letter. Now they enter a portal. You can still do reference letter uploads if you want to, but the big trend that we've started to see is shift to reference templates. So in the example that we're looking at, they're actually asking the reference to rank the applicant on a series of qualities that they're looking for in their scholars. I love that model. My only concern there is that if the person was asked to write the reference, they're probably going to give them a high score, right? So how accurate is this going to be? So what I would probably recommend doing instead is like, what are 2 to 3 short form essay prompts that you want the references to answer? And when I mean short form, I mean like 500 characters or less. Very, very short, very, very simple. And what happens here is the reference can simply come in. They answer those 3 questions as it appears. They don't have to print, they don't have to download, they don't have to open up, a Word document. They don't have to come up with ideas from scratch. They just see the question and they just answer the question. They can save it, they can log out, they can come back later. Now, the beauty of this is as soon as they submit it, it gets logged on the applicant's profile, which I'm going to show you here in just a minute as we look at the documents and those deliverables. But what the end outcome looks like is you lower the barrier for the applicants, for the references. Number 2 is a lot of times the applicants are waiting for their references to come in. So with this model, the applicants can work at their own time on their own pace and not have to worry about the references. And then number 3 is it gives you complete visibility on what's remaining. It also makes it so when you're comparing one candidate to another, you're actually comparing apples to apples because we can ensure that every reference kind of answered the same kind of questions, right? So there's a clear barometer that we're comparing against. So what does that look like as well? What do the deliverables look like? So in Reviewr, obviously you get this dashboard. And so I'm not going to go over your dashboarding at all today, keeping in mind that one of the slides I talked about was consolidating your workflows. So in Reviewr, you actually have a command center to manage the entire life cycle of your scholarships. One kind of cool thing to see here, though, is we can track progress. So I can see in real time who my applicants are, how far they've made it. I can send them reminder messages if they're not complete, etc. I can do the same thing for references or transcripts. So I can see in real time how many people were requested to submit a reference. Are they done or not done? If they're not done, who are they and how far have they made it? And I can also send them reminders. These seem like small things. I use the term experience quite a bit, but that's really what it's all about, is we're elevating the applicant experience by helping give them peace of mind that their references are going to get notified to ensure that they actually get submitted within a timely manner. So when you guys go to view content, maybe a quick raise of hands, how many people are using like Jotform or these built-in form tools? What happens in that use case is you need to go to those systems, find the information, download, export, and now you're living within a spreadsheet. In our system or whatever tools that you decide to use, ideally speaking, you get a menu of all of your applicants and you can sort and filter and find people however you want. And then what happens is when you open them up, said this before, that we're not dealing with data. Yes, we are dealing with data in the sense that we have forms, we've got file uploads, and results, but what we're really doing is we're dealing with people, and we have to treat them as such. So in this example, if I open an applicant up, we go old school. This is like circa 2010, where we have a binder, but now it's virtual. So Michael here is my scholar. I can see all the content that he or she submitted. This is actually identical to the form that we just looked at. So here's who they are. There's those academic achievements. If I keep scrolling, you're going to see references, you're going to see essays, you name it. Now from here, what you can do is you can directly communicate one-to-one with them. You can leave internal notes with your team. You can kind of collaborate with one another. And then more importantly here, what I want to talk about was those file uploads. So every document, every file that we uploaded shows up in this list. You can see I've got tax documents, I've got essays, I've got transcripts, I've got resumes, you name it. From here, I can simply press view. and those documents get embedded right in front of me. Again, this could be a FAFSA information, it could be a tax document. I can physically view and interact those documents in Reviewr. I never have to download, I never have to export, I never have to come back. And I can kind of scroll through them. So it was a video or an image, I can see it. There's your FAFSA summary, there's your tax documents, you name it. Going back to references. So there's a section in the system where any external deliverables submitted shows up. So in this example, both Steve and Paula submitted references on behalf of Michael. If I just click view, boom, there is that reference that was filled out. So in real time, it literally will consolidate all of these submission forms, all the file uploads, all the activities onto the applicant profile. This goes back to the first slide, which is why those profiles are so critical. Without a profile in place, we basically lose the ability to do virtually everything that we want to do with our scholarships. So for me, this is the most important topic. We'll talk about this for a couple more minutes for Q&A. Is it's designing a review and selection workflow. So I'm going to kind of just jump right in and walk you through this. But for me, there's kind of 3 or 4 common issues that we run into. Number one is purely logistics, right? You've got all these applications coming in. At some point, you have to decide who is going to be reviewing those applicants. Now, for some of you, it might be quite simple. Your entire staff reviews all the applicants, and that's great. For others, though, there might be a multi-phase review process. You might have committees. You might have 14 different scholarships. Each scholarship has both its own review criteria as well as its own review team. So anytime you start to layer on these added complexities, how do we start to divvy out applicants to our team with you having to manually do it? Number 2 is the actual formal process of conducting a review. So how do we redact data from the review team's perspective? I don't want them to see financial documents. I don't want them to see personal information. I don't want them to see demographics. Any content that you're collecting that in theory could alter the perception from the review team should be hidden from their point of view. And the last piece of that is the actual review process. And there's 2 components that come into this. Number 1 is logistics. It's not fair to your review team to tell them to go to a spreadsheet and start to fill in a bunch of cells with the results. It takes a lot of time. And then from a risk perspective, that means that you have to compile things, you have to run formulas, you have to merge stuff, and that it poses way too much human risk. The other element of that is the expectation or the experience from them. So when your review team comes in, how do you set very clear expectations of how you want them to review the applicants? How do you create consistency that when you go to generate the results, they're all looked at through the kind of the same lens? So how do we do that? We have a concept called buckets or review workflows. And the goal is not to train you or showcase the platform again too much here today, but the goal is you basically create buckets. And when you do this, you basically will take a bucket and you fill it up with 2 things. One is your applicants and the other is your review team. So if you've got 6 different scholarships, you would create 6 different buckets, 1 per scholarship. Using automation, when applicants are applying, the system would say, hey, Kyle applied to the Brooke Marlowe scholarship, therefore let's drop him into the Brooke Marlowe bucket. You can also create this as phases of review. So many scholarship providers will review the applicants, they'll vet through them, kind of at a high level, thumbs up, thumbs down, and then the top X number move on to phase 2. Phase 2 may have a completely separate team, completely separate scorecard. It could be an interview, whatever you would decide to do. You can also layer those. So you might have like a bunch of buckets for your different scholarships, and then you might have another bucket underneath for each of the different phases of review. So it's a way for you guys to do 3 things: categorize submissions, 2, create like a life cycle or a workflow, and then number 3 is actually to pair up your applicants with a team. So what does that look like? Down at the bottom here, I've got a section called phase 3. Again, you can call that whatever. I'm going to assume that in phase 3, there's a bunch of applicants. Off to the right, whenever Simon, Paula, and Mark come to Reviewr, they can physically only see the entries in phase 3. When Sally, Sue, and Steve at the top here come in, they could only see phase 1. So this is a very simple, clean way to create committees or buckets or pods of evaluators. What you could also do, you can open this up, and this is my preferred model for creating my review workflows. I like to use automation and randomization. So there's a pretty small number here. I only have 6 applicants in this bucket. What if this number was 106? And you've got a 10-person review team. Like, is it actually feasible for one of your team members to review 106 applications? Probably not, because I mentioned beforehand that our data suggests that on average, they can only review 15 to 25. So if that's the case, what you could do is you could bulk select both your applicants and or the review team and say, let's just make sure that every applicant gets looked at 3 times, no more, no less. Or you could say, I want my review team to look at no more than 20 people, but no less than 15. And then within Reviewr, the system will equally and randomly take your submissions, then auto assign it out to your review team to make those numbers map up. If you wanted more control over that, you can edit this. So it'll show you, okay, once we did that, here's all of our reviewers. Each one got roughly 3 submissions to review, and then here's who those 3 are. So if I edit Mark's name here, it'll show me exactly who Mark was assigned to, and then I can start to either unassign or reassign this back out to other people. So we're basically taking this complex process of taking all of your applicants and then pairing it up with your staff, either give them everybody, create committees, use automation, or one-to-one pairings. But the end goal here is now when Mark comes in, he or she is only going to see the scholarship applicants you want he or she to see, and it's going to be redacted because we can define what they see. So what does that look like? When your review teams come in, they basically see a menu or a list of all of the applicants. Again, you can redact the data, so if you want to show demographic details or PI, you don't have to. But for them, it's as simple as clicking open, right? They can just click view, and instead of asking them to go to like a Google Drive folder, find their forms, find their files, find their master spreadsheet, they get a side-by-side. So half of the page is the applicant profile, and then the other half is your selection tool. And it's as simple as them side by side independently reading through the form, answering a series of questions, ranking them. Again, they can look at the file uploads, they can references, and then if it is a mathematic-based scorecard, the system will do all the tabulations for you. So your review team just needs to simply answer a series of questions, and then they can move on to the next. One other kind of bonus tip for you guys here today is it's very easy for evaluators to get bogged down in numbers. So in this example, you have a section here called essay, and you're asking to rank them on a score from 1 to 10. That's not too bad, but if it was like 0 to 20, they're going to start to question like, well, what's a 16 versus what's a 17? And it really starts to slow them down, and the quality of reviews will start to drop pretty dramatically. So what I would prefer to see, and it's not actually showing up in this example, is I want them to be able to answer questions emotionally. So from good to great, how is this essay? From above average to below average, like tell me more about like their leadership, whatever your questions are. Your scorecard will align with both your application form, which then aligns with your own personal mission and vision, right? But anytime you ask the review team to answer a series of questions emotionally, they can do it very, very quickly. They're just giving their subjective input. It's going to be much higher quality, much faster. And then behind the scenes, you can still leverage scorecards because you can assign point values to their emotional response. So as soon as they submit, they move on to the next. They can very quickly go through 20 to 50 applications. But then your teams will basically get this leaderboard. And you can start to sort and filter by your different scholarships or your different phases of review. And you basically get this list, right, of every single applicant you received, who reviewed them, either individually or collectively, total scores and averages. And from here, you can start to leverage this math to make decisions. So for some of you, if you have a multi-phase program, that's great. You just select the top X number, and at the bottom, move them from one phase or one workflow to the next. Others are very cut and dry, and you say, okay, well, these are the results, and therefore, here's my recipients. Others, and I think this is a more common model, is it's very deliberate. So your team might pull this up and they talk about the results. Just because the data says one thing doesn't mean there isn't a compelling case that somebody wants to make for one of your applicants. So we don't make decisions for you. We just give you a ton of data to make data-informed decisions. So your review team can kind of talk about these applicants, and you can shuffle this and reorder this, and you can move people around to justify your results however you want to. One last little bonus I'm going to talk about here really, really quickly is the normalizing of results. So I've talked about how I love to randomize my submissions for my review team. However, that means that not every evaluator is going to be looking at the same applicants. So in this example down here, Mark scored Sheldon a 12, but Judge Judy scored it a 31. That's a huge difference to actually alter the results of this program. So I start to ask the question, okay, well, Mark score Sheldon low because it just wasn't a high quality submission, or is Mark a very tough judge? What I mean by that is, what if Mark has never given higher than a 13? By his or her own standards, they scored Sheldon very, very good. In comparison to Judge Judy, they scored it quite low, and because of that, the applicant is now being penalized, or in this case, rewarded because of Judge Judy. So what you can do, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, is got a cool report that normalizes it. It actually shows you individual judging tendencies. So it says, okay, on average, Judge Judy scores about a 24, but Tony scores about a 34. That's a full 10-point difference. So I don't actually care because I recruited these people to judge because I value their input. So I don't really care if Judge Judy gave it a 24, if Tony gave it a 34. What this data actually tells me is they scored an applicant completely average. If they scored an applicant higher than 24, it was higher than their own personal average. If it was lower than 24, it was lower than their own personal average. And then we can leverage automation to start to compare averages versus one another. So I'll leave it at that. If you want to talk more about this later on, but it's a really cool way to value the expertise from your review team, let them score however they want, but then not penalize people because of judging tendencies. So the last thing I want to talk about is measuring impact. So I think this is one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's actually very, very simple, but it's difficult in practice because it requires somebody to submit something to you. So very, very briefly, back in January, obviously the federal government for a very short time launched that memo pausing federal funds, right, to certain nonprofits. And many of them were left scrambling like, that's not fair because we're providing so much impact, but they don't have any mechanism in place to go back and say, hey, you can't pause our funding because of all the impact that we're having, because they don't know what impact that they actually have. On top of that, if they want to go raise additional funds to grow their programs, how do you pitch a funder saying, hey, by investing into our scholarship, here's the impact that you're going to have on people's lives? So again, in practice, it's actually very, very simple. You just need your applicants to self-report the impact you had on them. Now, where the difficulty lies is what is their um, how do we hold them accountable to actually submit? They've already got funded, right? Like what incentive do they have to self-report? And there isn't one, right? So the goal here is that you absolutely have to lower the barrier for making self-reporting simple. We want them to get like an SMS text message or an email saying, hey, please click here and fill out this short 3-minute survey. That's all it takes. And then the result of that survey can get aggregated amongst all of your applicants. And then that becomes so powerful because you can start to take those metrics and build out like impact dashboards or surveys. You could say, hey, of the 52 people we funded, here's the demographic background of them. Here's the average dollar amount that we funded. Here's the average grades that they received. Here's all these incredible metrics. So again, the only way you can do that is two things: lower the barrier, and two is centralize it. So what does that look like? If I go back to this example here, I think this will have it for us. Let's hypothetically pretend that Michael is a scholarship recipient. What he or she would do is come back into the system because they got some notification and click add new. From there, it says, well, what are you trying to add? In this example, it's a scholar acceptance packet, but it could be like impact tracking survey, whatever you want to call it. Once they click that, they just simply answer a series of questions. And again, these questions are going to be dictated by you. Every one of you is going to have different metrics that you're going to report back on. This needs to align with both your application form and how you define your scholarships or grants as a success, right? But you just answer a series of questions and then they're done. That's it. Why this works so well is, again, it can be done on a mobile device. It's very, very low barrier. As soon as they submit this, it gets logged on their account. So now looking bigger picture and going back to the concept of a profile, I have Michael, I have his or her submission form, I have his or her file uploads, I've got every piece of communication that ever happened. I have the review and selection process logged here. And then now I have any ongoing deliverables that they submitted to. When you go to generate reports or build out those dashboards, you're not left trying to figure out like, where does it live? Is it in my inbox? Is it in an online form? Is it in my database? It's all right here. And so it makes impact reporting actually feasible. So the last thing here is, what are you actually measuring? I can kind of share out some examples, but for me, I want to break this into 3 components. One is acceptance. So anytime somebody gets selected as a scholar, I want them to submit an acceptance packet, which you're already doing, right? Where the check's going to be sent to, what is it going to be used for? Also like, media release, consent forms, you name it. I want a short, and I'm going to send you guys as well a prior webinar we hosted about this topic. I want a mid check-in. So that's basically like if we're running into risks, like for example, like was there a issue with their family and they had to leave school for 3 weeks and because of that they fell behind, right? How do you start to identify that stuff right away so you can provide resources or connect them with the resources they need to kind of get back on track? Then I want to do your long-term study. So upon graduation or 1 year later, tell us more about like your grades, the student loans that you might have incurred, all these things. If you want to get really fancy, this is the hardest one to do, is 3 years from now, since all the data lives in one spot, trigger it again. Now that it's been 3 years, like, do you have a job? If so, is it in your career field that you went to school for? What's your salary? And then you can start to compare those against industry averages. And what a cool story to tell by saying, hey, founders or hey, funders, we've been doing this scholarship now for 6 years. And on average, our scholars have this grade compared to the industry average. They have this much lower student loan debt. And each one of them has achieved careers in their career path, but also they've got a 14% higher starting salary than if they hadn't received a scholarship. So again, that's like really high in the sky goals. But reality speaking, like you can get there with this type of mechanism in place. So with all that said, those are the core challenges as well as some of the best practices that if I was to launch a scholarship, I would be structuring right now. I want to open it up for any question and answer. This could be about Reviewr, it could be about your own kind of personal processes, it could be about topics. If any of you guys are running into challenges that you want to kind of ask about, I'm happy to either answer them myself or there might be other people here that might want to chime in. But again, my goal here today was to, provide as much value as I could around some of these best practices and how to actually start to implement these. We will follow up with a recap of this webinar, both in a recording form, but also kind of a best practice guide. So like, what are these key sections? And then like, what's potentially some homework for you? Like, what are some action items that you can do to start to deploy those right away? So yeah, I'll send that out here probably here in the next couple of days, but I will stay on for as long as you guys want for any questions that you might have for me. Yeah, so a question came in around like the ability to print applications. So yeah, I mean, like we live in a time now where we want to be as digital as possible. With that said, like there's two use cases where like moving offline still happens quite a bit. Number one is I would still highly recommend for everybody to archive and export deliverables out, either for offline storage or if you're using like databases or other tools that serve as like the record of truth, you have to be able to move that data over. I also see some use cases where, again, from like an ADA accessibility perspective, or just from like the demographic of who your review team is, they still may want to have like physical copies to review and score off of. Or, maybe you have like the top 10 people that you've selected, and you've got a team of board members who are all sitting in an office together, and you want to review them. So in Reviewr, you can virtually export and download anything on demand. One of the easiest exports, I think, for this question specifically is you can download with one click, you can get a zip file. And then within that file will be a folder per applicant. And each one of their own personal folders will have a PDF of their submission form, as well as all of their supporting documents and deliverables. So that's very simple for printing purposes. It's very simple for archiving. It's very simple for like importing into other tools. It's not uncommon to see people also score offline and then just manually kind of come back and log the results as well. So yeah, printing off for your review team is certainly viable. On that note, there are some customizations of the output. One thing to note though is that anytime you start to print and export, things like the redaction of data becomes a bit more complex. Obviously, with the online tools, it's easier for you to kind of like target certain sections and hide it from people's point of views because we can kind of control the environment. So, yeah, if you're concerned about data redaction or if you've got sensitive information like file uploads, again, you don't want living on paper because they're safe and secure. Those are some of the things that you might want to avoid exporting and kind of keeping in the system. Other questions? Yeah, so yeah, in regards to like price points of the software, I'd love to have those conversations. Not that we're private, it's more so we offer dynamic pricing at Reviewr. So there's usually a subscription. Our goal is to let you use Reviewr for as much as you want. So our subscriptions are like kind of all inclusive. You can use this for as much or as little as you want. And then oftentimes they'll target the number of submissions that you receive. That way you don't alienate small or large programs. So there's different tiers based on the number of submissions that you receive, and that will dictate like what your subscription is. And then from there, every organization has different kind of like accounting or billing needs. Some people like to do annual subscriptions. Some people like to do monthly. So those are some of the details that we can hash out. Question for the letters of reference. Um, can you only allow institutional email addresses? Yeah, so in Reviewr, when you go to submit, not just a reference, but you could also argue that this would be like from an applicant's perspective or types of file uploads. You can create, and by you, I mean like we can assist an expression that basically says like don't allow Gmails or only allow certain .edu addresses or only allow a .pdf, etc. So when the applicant tries to submit, like say for example, Kyle at gmail.com, it would say you have to use a work email, right? And then if they change it to Reviewr, then it will allow them to go through. Great questions. What other kind of questions can I start to answer for people? While I'm waiting for more questions, I'll go back to the references. I think why this works so well is traditionally speaking, like most references have a private process around it. So if you're the person who is submitting the reference, even though you're probably going to say nice things, generally they don't want to see it go through the hands of the applicant. So that poses a bit of a challenge operationally, because then how are they going to submit it to you? And more times than not, they're going to send you an email with a bunch of attachments, or if you have another form. So then you're left kind of figuring out like, okay, well, I just got this reference, like who does it belong to? And then how do I connect it with the applicant from my review team, as well as redact information from it? And then on top of that, from like a barrier perspective, like we want to make it easy for the references. If you're including that in your review, you probably need it from everybody. And so how do you not kind of like chase your tail trying to follow up on references when you don't even know who you have? So the goal there is like obviously you have complete visibility on who's been requested to submit a reference. You can automate the reminder process. You can track if they're done or not done. But then the beauty is once it gets submitted, you don't have to do anything with it. It automatically gets attached back to the applicant's profile. Question on restricted funds to award scholarships. Can you award basically like scholarship amounts and a fund name? Yeah, what you can do, and that's kind of comes down to the selection decision-making process. So we kind of talked about this conversation where like you review your applicants and you are deciding basically, are you going to get a scholarship or not based off of a scorecard. That's one model. But what happens if like not every scholar receives the same amount? So like, what if you're only covering for somebody, room and board for somebody else? So in our selection workflow, you can basically, as you are selecting people, you can log like what they were selected for, and then you can have like basically overarching budget. So if each scholarship has a separate fund associated with it, you can then start to allocate funds to individual people, and then kind of get a remaining balance, right, until it's been capped out, or maybe you have leftover funding available. So when you go to generate reports, then you can start to say, hey, for this scholarship, we awarded 16 people. Here's the average amount per person. Here's how much each person received, things of that nature. Question came in around, can this be used for grants? So yeah, Reviewr is used for scholarships, grants, award programs, fellowships, board nominations, on testing, you name it. So the content that you're collecting in a grant will be very different than a scholarship. Your selection process will also be different, but the three core consistencies still stay the same. You've got some type of submitter, you have to operate and manage those applications, and then at some point you're going to go through a review and selection process. We've got dedicated tools and features for each one of them. Questions that came in around integrations. Probably a more of like an offline question to better define like what your current tools and processes look like around like auditing that you reference. So can we integrate with other tools? Yeah, absolutely. We've got a full development team. We have APIs that we can talk about. My first question kind of comes down to like, what is the goal behind integration? A lot of times it's easy to invest time and money integrating tools, and then we don't actually gain any real benefit from it. So it's more so like figuring out like what are the different tools being used for, and then is it a simple import export? Can we pull data in? So the answer to your question is yes, absolutely. Would rather first better define like what the integration needs would be to figure out like where it would make sense to do it. Question came in about accepting scholarship application fees. So Reviewr natively has a PayPal Payments Pro integration. We're working on other payment gateway integrations currently. We chose PayPal just because of the extreme flexibility it has. Think of it like as a shopping cart concept where when you go to apply for a scholarship, you may have logic in place that dictates the amount, right? So if you apply to 3 scholarships, does the dollar amount change? Do you have like an early fee versus a late fee? All that becomes realistic in Reviewr. But basically what happens is as soon as they go to submit, the system will kind of identify, okay, like do they owe you money or not? And if so, what do they owe you? And then it'll integrate with PayPal where they can just pay integrated within the system. The beauty of that is you own your own funds. It never touches our hands. So you own your own account, but the systems talk to each other. So it'll actually show you a list of every applicant, how they decided to pay either online or, maybe they requested a check or an invoice. It'll show you submitted but paid, submitted not paid, all that type of stuff becomes realistic now. So the answer question is yes, via PayPal Payments Pro. Great questions. And it looks like we still have a couple dozen people here roughly. So yeah, I mean, I'll hang out for as long as you guys want, whatever else I can answer, about the platform, about processes, or, if any of you have any like nagging challenges that you've been running into that you want insights on. Again, the beauty of what I do at Reviewr is I've had the opportunity to work with thousands and thousands of programs. And so by now I like to say I've seen virtually everything. And if I can't get you a solution, I definitely think I can find a place to get it for you. Okay. Getting pretty quiet. So with that said, we'll send out a recap of this conversation. We'll give you a whole bunch of good both resources, interactive examples and tours. I'm not naive that some of you are looking more for resources. Some of you are actually very interested in potentially using Reviewr. So if you want to kind of dive deeper into the system, please do let me know. But yeah, whatever else I can do for you, I really appreciate you attending, but also your participation today. So with that said, I hope everyone has a good one. And as always, if you need anything from me, please don't be a stranger.